Welcome back to Scripture Horror. Tonight we journey once more into the haunting silence of America's highways, unveiling 7 bone-chilling true trucker horror stories. Each tale is more disturbing than the last, sourced directly from the drivers who've braved the darkest, most desolate roads in the country. What you're about to hear is not a work of fiction. These are actual events shared by the brave souls who experienced the unexplainable horrors of the open road. For privacy, some names have been changed, but the terrifying details are untouched. If you're new to Scripture Horror, don't forget to subscribe for daily true horror stories that will make you question what lurks in the shadows. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a spine-tingling episode. And if you or someone you know has encountered something terrifying on the road, share your story in the comments. Your experience could shed light on the very real dangers truckers face every day. Mike Patterson had been driving long haul for years when he encountered something that made him consider hanging up his keys for good. It was a cold February night in 2015, and he was hauling electronics from California to Tennessee on Interstate 40. What started as a routine drive through the Arizona desert became a terrifying game of cat and mouse that lasted over 500 miles. Around 3 a.m., just past Flagstaff, Mike noticed headlights in his mirrors. Nothing unusual about that. Truckers often travel in loose convoys for safety and company. But these headlights stayed exactly the same distance behind him, mile after mile. When Mike sped up, the vehicle sped up. When he slowed down, it slowed down too. At first, Mike figured it was just another trucker trying to draft behind his trailer to save fuel. It's a common practice, though dangerous when done too close. But after an hour of this precise following, Mike started getting uncomfortable. He tried the CB radio, calling out on Channel 19, asking if the driver behind him was trying to communicate. Silence. Just static. Mike could feel his heart rate pick up. He checked his mirrors again. Nothing but those relentless headlights. No car in sight, just the empty road stretching out in front of him. He decided to test his follower. He took the next exit for a truck stop near Winslow. The headlights followed him off the interstate through the ramp. But instead of pulling into the truck stop, Mike made a sharp right onto a smaller road, hoping to shake off whoever was behind him. The headlights followed again, but this time they stayed further back, keeping just enough distance to not be obvious. Mike's mind was racing. Was it a prank? A psycho driver? Or worse? He decided to keep his foot on the gas and get some distance. He kept pushing the truck down the road, making sharp turns, but the headlights were still there, lurking in his rearview mirror. His fingers gripped the wheel, knuckles white. Another hour passed, and Mike's nerves were shot. He reached for the CB again, this time calling out more urgently. "Whoever is behind me, if you're a trucker, pull up beside me. Let's talk." Nothing, no reply. Just silence. He was nearly at a breaking point, thinking about pulling over to confront whoever it was when his headlights flickered. For a split second, he thought he'd lost the tail, but then it happened again. His truck's engine sputtered. Mike's heart jumped into his throat. The truck's lights dimmed. Panic set in. He slammed the gear shift into neutral and floored the pedal, hoping to get the truck back on track. Nothing. The truck was dead. Mike pulled over onto the shoulder and killed the engine, praying it was just a mechanical failure. He jumped out, inspecting the truck under the dim glow of the emergency lights. That's when he heard it. The faint sound of a horn honking in the distance. Not a truck horn, but a car horn. A single long beep, followed by silence. Mike quickly climbed back into the cab, locked the doors, and grabbed his phone. No signal. Nothing but a dead zone. He was alone, in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest town. The headlights from the vehicle behind him had stopped. There was no sound, no movement. Just the absolute silence of the desert. Every inch of his body screamed to leave, but Mike couldn't move. He felt like he was being watched. Mike stared into the darkness. His headlights blinked, flickered, then steadied. Then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, soft yet deliberate, came from the back of the truck. In a moment of sheer panic, Mike grabbed the flashlight from the passenger seat and shone it through the back window of the cab. Nothing. But the footsteps continued. He could feel the weight of someone or something approaching. With no other choice, Mike started the truck, but the engine sputtered again. The air was thick with tension, and his heart was pounding as he shifted gears, trying to keep the truck running. A strange, muffled noise came from the other side, the sound of something scratching at the side of the trailer. The hairs on Mike's neck stood up. The noise was now louder, more aggressive. He could see the shadow of something on the other side of the truck. It moved in jerky, unnatural motions, and that's when he realized it wasn't a person. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. In the split second it took for him to process what was happening, he heard the sound of something being dragged across the gravel. The shadow loomed closer, and Mike's panic reached its peak. His hand slammed on the horn, but there was no response. Nothing moved. No lights flickered. It was just him and the desert. He grabbed the wheel with both hands, ready to drive away, when suddenly, the trailer door at the back of his truck slammed open. The sound of metal scraping against metal filled the air. Mike froze. He couldn't move. His legs locked beneath him as the door creaked open wider, slowly revealing the dark figure standing in the doorway. It was tall, towering over Mike's truck, and its features were obscured by the shadow of the night. It wasn't a human. It had a face, but not a face like anything Mike had seen before. The face was pale, with hollow, dark eyes that seemed to suck in the light, and its body seemed too thin, too stretched out, like a creature designed to haunt the nightmares of anyone who dared cross its path. The thing slowly reached for the truck door, its fingers twisting unnaturally as it tried to open it. Mike could see the claws now. It was like nothing he had ever seen, not human, not animal, but something in between. Mike's breath hitched in his throat. He reached for the gearshift again and slammed it into drive. The truck roared to life, jerking forward with all the power he could muster. His heart was pounding as he sped off, tires screeching against the dry desert road. He didn't look back, but he could hear the footsteps, slow, steady, and never-ending, following him as he raced into the night. The headlights were back, this time closer. Closer than ever before. Mike's fingers tightened on the wheel, and he could feel the sweat dripping down his forehead as he pushed the truck faster. But no matter how fast he went, the headlights remained in his rearview mirror, and that feeling of being watched never left him. It wasn't just the trucker behind him now. It was something else. Something much worse. As the road stretched on, Mike saw a sign for a small rest stop up ahead. He took the exit without thinking, swerving the truck into the gravel parking lot. The headlights followed, and Mike slammed the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt just as he reached the edge of the lot. He didn't wait. He threw open the door and ran, not looking back for a second. He didn't stop until he reached the nearby diner. He burst through the door, gasping for air, his heart racing. The waitress looked up, startled by his frantic entrance. "What's wrong?" she asked. Mike couldn't form the words. He couldn't explain the terror he had just experienced. All he could do was sit down, staring at the door, waiting for the headlights to follow him inside. But they never came. Mike Patterson never drove at night again. He handed in his keys, leaving the road behind for good. The lights had followed him, but they never caught up. Whatever had been out there, stalking the lonely highways, was still waiting. Danny Reeves had seen it all during his years of long-haul trucking. Dead animals on the highway, car accidents, severe weather. Nothing fazed him anymore. But what happened on a foggy October night in Nevada made him question his own sanity and nearly quit trucking forever. It all started with a dispatch call that didn't make sense. Danny was finishing his mandatory rest period at a truck stop in Ely, Nevada, when his company called with an urgent pickup. A truck had broken down on the side of Highway 50, and his load needed to be transferred to Danny's trailer. The original driver had suffered a medical emergency and was airlifted to Salt Lake City. What struck Danny as odd was the location, mile marker 250, deep in the Nevada desert, where there were no towns, no services, and nothing but empty highway stretching for miles in either direction. It was an unusual place for a truck to break down, especially when there were truck stops to the east and west. The dispatcher was unusually insistent. "The customer is paying triple rate for immediate pickup," she said. "The load is time-sensitive medical supplies. Every hour counts." The money was too good to pass up, so Danny headed out into the desert night. A thick fog had rolled in from nowhere, reducing visibility to about 50 feet. Danny had driven this stretch of Highway 50, known as America's loneliest road, hundreds of times, but he'd never seen fog like this. It seemed to cling to the asphalt, creating a tunnel-like effect in his headlights. At mile marker 250, Danny found the abandoned truck exactly where dispatch had said it would be. But something was wrong immediately. The truck was old, much older than any commercial vehicle should be operating legally. The paint was faded and rust streaked the metal, and the trailer looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. No company logos, no DOT numbers, no identifying marks at all. The trailer doors were open, revealing a load of wooden crates stacked floor to ceiling. In the dim light of his flashlight, Danny saw the crates were old and weathered, with shipping labels so faded they were unreadable. Some of the wood was water-damaged, others rotted. This didn't look like medical supplies. Danny tried calling his dispatcher to clarify, but his phone showed no signal. Not unusual in the Nevada desert, but the timing felt off. He tried his CB radio. Nothing but static on all channels, which was very unusual. There was almost always chatter on the CB, especially from other truckers. Despite his growing unease, Danny began transferring the crates. They were heavier than they looked, and some made strange rattling sounds when moved, like they contained loose objects rolling around inside. Others seemed to contain liquid. He could hear sloshing when he picked them up. The smell was getting to him too, a musty chemical odor that made his eyes water and his throat burn. As Danny loaded the last crate, something caught his eye that made his blood run cold. On the side of one crate, barely visible in the faded wood, were partial letters, formaldehyde, and below that, toxic. Danny had just loaded what appeared to be containers of formaldehyde and other toxic chemicals into his trailer, but his dispatcher had said they were medical supplies. Formaldehyde was used in medical settings, but not in unmarked, deteriorating containers, transported without proper hazmat documentation. Danny tried his phone again. Still no signal. He walked around the abandoned truck looking for paperwork, bills of lading, anything that might explain what he'd just loaded. The cab of the old truck was unlocked, and when Danny climbed inside, the smell hit him like a wall. It was the same chemical odor from the crates, but much stronger, mixed with something else, something organic and foul. The truck's interior was covered in a thin layer of rust-colored dust. The seats were cracked and stained, and there were dark spots on the floor that looked suspiciously like dried blood. On the dashboard, Danny found a logbook, but when he opened it, the entries made no sense. The dates went back years, but the handwriting changed frequently, as if different people had been using the same book. Some entries were in languages Danny didn't recognize. The most recent entry, dated days earlier, read, "Delivery complete. Contents disposed of properly." No witnesses. Danny's hands started shaking as he read the entry again. Contents disposed of? What contents? And why was there a note about witnesses? Danny climbed down from the old truck's cab and noticed something that made him stumble backward in horror. In the dirt beside the truck, partially hidden by tumbleweeds, were several small white objects. When Danny shined his flashlight on them, he realized they were bones. Small bones, like from fingers or toes, and they looked human. Panic set in. Danny ran back to his truck, planning to call 911 as soon as he got cell service. But when he climbed into his cab, his CB radio crackled to life. Unit 7, this is dispatch. What's your status on that pickup? Danny grabbed his CB handset. Dispatch, this is 7. I need to talk to you about this load. Something's not right here. I think I need to call the police. Static filled the channel for several seconds. Then, you need to complete that delivery. The customer is waiting. Dispatch, I found bones, human bones. And the crates smell like chemicals. This isn't medical supplies. More static. Then a different voice. You didn't see anything. Complete the delivery. The voice wasn't his dispatcher. It was deeper, rougher, with an accent Danny couldn't place. Danny tried responding, but all he got was static. Danny made a decision. He would drive to the nearest town with cell service and call the police. Let them sort out what was in those crates. But when Danny tried to start his truck, nothing happened. The engine wouldn't turn over. All his electrical systems were dead. No lights, no radio, no GPS. In the Nevada desert at night, with no way to call for help, Danny was stranded. The fog was getting thicker, and the temperature was dropping fast. Danny had emergency supplies in his truck, but the thought of spending the night next to whatever was in those crates made his skin crawl. Danny tried to flag down passing traffic, but in 2 hours, only 2 vehicles passed, and neither stopped. The fog was so thick that by the time Danny could see headlights, they were already past his location. Around 3 a.m., Danny heard sounds coming from his trailer, scratching, like something was trying to get out of one of the crates. Then, what sounded like whispers. Multiple voices speaking in low tones that Danny couldn't understand. Danny told himself it was the wind, or his imagination, or the stress of the situation. But the sounds continued. Danny grabbed his flashlight and reluctantly walked to the back of his trailer. The sounds stopped the moment he approached. When he shined his light inside, everything looked the same as when he loaded it. But one of the crates, a crate he was sure he'd secured properly, had shifted position and was now sitting at an angle. As Danny examined the crate more closely, he noticed the wood was splintered in several places, as if something had been pushing against it from the inside. Fresh splinters, not the old weather damage he'd seen earlier. Danny's flashlight began to flicker and dim, even though he'd just changed the batteries. In the weakening light, he saw something that made him stumble backward. One of the crates had dark liquid seeping from between the wooden slats, not the clear liquid he'd heard sloshing earlier. This was thick and dark and had the same organic smell he'd noticed in the old truck's cab. Danny slammed his trailer doors shut and backed away. Whatever was in those crates, he didn't want to know anymore. He just wanted to get away from this place. Just before dawn, Danny's truck suddenly roared to life on its own. All the electrical systems came back online simultaneously. His CB radio immediately crackled with his dispatcher's voice. 7, what's your status? You missed your check-in. It was his normal dispatcher, the woman he'd spoken to earlier. Danny tried to explain what had happened, but she seemed confused. Danny, what are you talking about? We don't have any pickups scheduled for you. You're supposed to be en route to Denver with that electronics load you picked up yesterday. Danny looked around in the growing daylight. The old truck was gone. His trailer was empty. The fog had lifted completely, and he could see for miles in every direction. There was no evidence that anything had been there. No tire tracks, no bones, no sign of the abandoned vehicle. Danny drove straight to the nearest truck stop and called his company. According to their records, he had never been dispatched to mile marker 250. There was no medical supplies pickup, no broken-down truck, no emergency load. His GPS showed he'd been parked at the truck stop in Ely all night. But Danny knew what he'd experienced. The smell of those chemicals lingered in his truck for weeks afterward, no matter how many times he had it cleaned. He found scratches on his trailer floor that hadn't been there before, and his logbook had an entry he didn't remember making. Delivery complete. Contents disposed of properly. Danny never drove Highway 50 at night again. He later learned from other truckers that mile marker 250 had a reputation. Several drivers had reported similar experiences over the years. Mysterious pickups, chemical smells, strange sounds from their trailers. Some drivers quit trucking entirely after encounters near that location. The Nevada Highway Patrol has no record of any incidents at mile marker 250, but local truckers know to avoid that stretch of highway after dark. They say some loads are meant to stay buried in the desert, and some deliveries should never be completed. Tommy had been a long-haul trucker for years, used to the endless stretches of highway, the solitude of the road, and the unusual situations that came with hauling cargo across America. He thought he'd seen it all, the strange and the terrifying, but nothing could have prepared him for what happened one December night in 20XX. It started like any other job. He received a call from a broker he'd never worked with before, but the pay was too good to pass up. Double his usual rate for a simple refrigerated haul from Amarillo, Texas to Chicago. The catch? The pickup location was an abandoned meat processing plant on the outskirts of town, a facility that had been closed down years ago due to environmental violations. Tommy's job was to transport the frozen inventory to a disposal facility in Illinois. When he arrived at the facility around 9 p.m., it looked like something straight out of a horror movie. The building had broken windows, peeling paint, and weeds creeping through the cracks in the parking lot. The only lights were a few security floods casting long, harsh shadows across the loading dock. A man in coveralls, thin and pale, greeted Tommy. His hands shook slightly as he handed over the paperwork. "You need to keep this load at exactly 34 degrees F," the man instructed, his voice low. "Any warmer, And, well, just don't let it get warmer. Tommy nodded, noting the odd smell in the air. It was metallic and sweet, like a mix of copper pennies and rotting fruit. Probably just old meat, he thought. Nothing unusual. The trailer was already loaded and sealed when Tommy backed up to it. A standard refrigerated trailer, just as he'd expected. Nothing out of the ordinary, except for the smell. He chalked it up to the place being run down and the cargo being poorly stored. He sealed the doors and began the long drive north. It wasn't long before the first strange thing happened. About 20 miles outside Amarillo, Tommy's refrigeration unit, which had been humming steadily at 34 degrees Fahrenheit, suddenly spiked to 45 degrees Fahrenheit. He pulled over immediately, checking the unit, but everything seemed normal. The temperature dropped back to 34 degrees Fahrenheit on its own after a minute or so Tommy shrugged it off and continued. That's when the thumping started. It was a loud, rhythmic noise coming from the back of the trailer, like something heavy had shifted or was moving. Tommy, having hauled freight for years, knew that this wasn't just the usual load settling. The sound was deliberate. It was too rhythmic, almost like something was alive inside the trailer. Tommy tried to reach out on the CB radio, but all he heard was static, faint whispers that sounded more like urgent pleading than communication. His own voice came back distorted, like an echo from a deep cave. The strange noises from the trailer didn't stop either. In fact, they grew worse. Around midnight, as he crossed into Oklahoma, the thumping became regular. 3 quick impacts, followed by silence, then 3 more. It was always the same pattern. Tommy pulled over at a rest area to investigate, but as soon as he got out of his truck, the sound stopped. He walked around the trailer, checking the seals and the refrigeration unit. Everything appeared normal, but when he looked down, something caught his eye. The ground beneath the trailer had a layer of ice from condensation, and within that ice he saw dark streaks, like something red had been dripping from the inside of the trailer and freezing upon contact with the ground. Tommy got back in the cab, his mind racing. He tried calling his dispatcher, but his phone had full signal strength yet couldn't connect any calls. He checked his GPS, which was malfunctioning, showing coordinates that weren't anywhere near his actual location. A farm in Nebraska, a rest stop in Kansas, empty fields. Nothing made sense. The thumping started again once Tommy resumed driving, but now it was different. Instead of the regular 3-beat pattern, it sounded like something was walking around inside the trailer. Heavy footsteps, moving from the front to the back, then back to the front again. Tommy's stomach dropped. He had hauled livestock before, and the sound was unmistakable. It was the sound of cattle moving. But this load wasn't supposed to contain cattle. It was frozen meat. Things got worse as Tommy neared the Kansas border. His headlights began flickering intermittently. During the brief moments of darkness, he swore he could see shapes moving alongside his truck. Figures running parallel to his trailer at highway speed. When his lights flickered back on, nothing was there. Tommy told himself it was just fatigue or tricks of the light, but the shapes seemed too large, too purposeful, to be anything but real. By 2 a.m., Tommy heard a noise that made his blood run cold, scratching sounds coming from directly behind the cab. It was as if claws were scraping against the inside wall of the trailer. The scratching was slow, deliberate, always staying just behind him. When he sped up, it sped up. When he slowed, the scratching stayed right with him. Tommy pulled into a truck stop near Wichita, hoping to rest and wait for daylight. But as soon as he parked and turned off his engine, the scratching intensified. It sounded like multiple sets of claws frantically working at the inside of his trailer, accompanied by strange, muffled voices. Not quite human, but rhythmic and filled with urgency. When Tommy tried to ask other truckers if they had heard the sounds, they avoided him, looking at his trailer with expressions of disgust or fear. One older driver grabbed Tommy by the arm and whispered, "Son, you need to get that load where it's going tonight. Don't stop again." Back on the highway, Tommy's refrigeration unit started malfunctioning. The temperature would spike to 45 degrees Fahrenheit, then plummet to 30 degrees Fahrenheit, then spike again. Every time the temperature rose, the sounds from inside the trailer grew more violent. Banging, scraping, and what sounded like something heavy being dragged across the floor. By the time Tommy crossed into Missouri, his fuel gauge was dropping faster than it should have. He'd started with a full tank, but after only 150 miles, it was already reading less than half full. His engine temperature, too, was rising, even though it was a cold December night. Tommy pulled over to check his engine, and that's when he saw something that made him seriously consider abandoning the truck. The entire back of his trailer was covered in a thin layer of ice. But this ice was red. Dark red streaks ran down the doors to the ground, freezing into strange crystalline formations that looked almost like reaching fingers. The smell was overwhelming now, not just metallic and sweet, but rancid, like a rotting animal. Tommy's CB radio crackled to life. "Driver, you need to complete that delivery. They're getting restless back there." The voice was calm, too calm. Tommy's heart raced. "Restless? What are you talking about?" Static. Then the voice came back, clearer this time. "The temperature's been rising. They don't like the warmth. Get them to Chicago before dawn or they'll find their own way out." Tommy tried to respond, but his radio died again. The rest of the drive was a blur of mechanical failures, strange noises, and figures in his mirrors that disappeared when he looked directly at them. The scratching and banging reached a climax as he approached Chicago. It sounded like a riot was happening inside his trailer, voices shouting, objects being thrown, and underneath it all, a sound like running water. Tommy delivered the load just as the sun was rising. The receiving crew wore full hazmat suits, working quickly to unhook his trailer without speaking to Tommy. When he tried to ask what was inside, they waved him off and told him to leave immediately. As Tommy drove away, he glimpsed the workers using industrial steamers and pressure washers on the inside of his trailer. The runoff water was dark red. Tommy's truck required extensive cleaning and repairs after that delivery. The refrigeration unit was completely replaced, and mechanics found deep scratch marks inside the trailer marks that cut through the metal. They formed patterns, almost like words, but in a language Tommy didn't recognize. Tommy never took another load from that broker again. He learned to avoid any runs involving closed meat processing plants. Other drivers at truck stops would sometimes mention similar experiences: loads that made strange noises, refrigeration units that malfunctioned, and mechanical issues after hauling certain types of cargo. They'd learned not to ask too many questions about their loads, especially when the paperwork was vague about the origins of the meat or how long it had been stored. Tommy still drives at night, but he's more selective about the loads he picks up. He's learned that some cargo carries more than just freight. It carries the weight of whatever happened before it ended up in your trailer. Poor Ray Hutchinson had been driving solo for years when he encountered the convoy that changed everything. It was a bitter February night, and Ray was hauling auto parts from Detroit to Jacksonville on I-75. What started as a routine drive through Kentucky soon became a journey into something that defied explanation, leaving Ray questioning everything he thought he knew about the highways he had traveled thousands of times. Around midnight, just south of Lexington, Ray noticed a line of trucks ahead of him moving in perfect formation. 7 big rigs, all identical white Peterbilts, traveling exactly 55 mph in the right lane with their hazard lights flashing in unison. Ray had seen convoys before. Truckers often traveled together for safety or companionship, but something about this group felt different. Each truck was pristine, almost gleaming under the highway lights despite the winter weather. There were no company logos, no identifying marks, just pure white tractors pulling matching white trailers. The synchronization was unnerving. When one truck signaled, they all signaled. When one adjusted speed, they all adjusted at exactly the same moment. Ray tried hailing them on his CB radio. "Convoy of white Peterbilts on I-75 southbound. This is Freight Dog, looking for a radio check." Nothing but static. Ray tried different channels, but the airwaves were eerily quiet. Usually there's chatter on the CB at all hours, especially from night drivers trying to stay awake. But tonight, the radio was dead silent. Ray decided to pass the convoy. But as he moved into the left lane, something strange happened. His speedometer showed he was doing 65 mph, but he wasn't gaining on the trucks at all. They maintained their exact spacing and speed relative to his position, as if they were matching his pace without changing their own speed indicators. Ray pushed his truck harder, hitting 70 mph according to his gauge, but the white convoy stayed in the same position relative to him. It was like they were all connected by invisible cables, moving as one unit regardless of individual speeds. Ray's engine was working harder, fuel consumption increasing, but the distance between him and the convoy remained constant. Frustrated and confused, Ray dropped back into the right lane behind the convoy. Immediately, his truck settled into the same 55 mph pace without him touching the accelerator. His engine RPMs dropped to match the convoy's rhythm, and his truck seemed to lock into the formation automatically. That's when Ray noticed something that made his skin crawl. Through the rear window of the truck directly in front of him, he could see the driver's silhouette. The figure sat perfectly still, unnaturally upright, never moving or adjusting position. No head movement, no arm motion, nothing. For over an hour, the driver didn't shift, scratch, or make any of the small movements people make unconsciously. Ray tried his CB again, this time addressing the truck in front of him directly. "White Peterbilt with the still driver, you got your ears on?" The static seemed to respond, forming patterns that almost sounded like words but distorted beyond recognition. Around 2 a.m., Ray noticed they had passed several exit ramps without any of the convoy trucks signaling or changing lanes. Most long-haul drivers take breaks every few hours, but this convoy showed no signs of stopping. Ray needed fuel soon, but something kept him from breaking away from the formation. Every time he considered taking an exit, his truck seemed to resist. The steering wheel felt heavy and unresponsive when he tried to move toward an off-ramp. Ray's fuel gauge was approaching empty when the convoy suddenly signaled and took an exit Ray had never noticed before. The exit ramp appeared out of nowhere, unmarked and unlit, leading into darkness beyond Ray's headlight range. Ray's truck followed automatically as if it were being pulled by some invisible force. The exit led to a 2-lane road that stretched into complete blackness. No streetlights, no buildings, no signs of civilization anywhere, just pavement disappearing into the void. Ray tried to break away from the convoy, but his steering wheel wouldn't respond. His truck maintained its position in the formation, no matter how hard he tried to turn. Ray's CB radio crackled to life with a transmission that chilled him to the bone. "Welcome to the permanent route, driver. Your delivery schedule has been extended." The voice was mechanical, emotionless, like a computer trying to mimic human speech. Ray grabbed his handset. "What route? Where are we going?" "I need to get back to I-75. Static. Then there is no going back. The convoy requires 7 trucks. You are truck number 7. Ray looked around frantically and realized something horrifying. He was no longer the last truck in the convoy. Behind him, stretching back into the darkness, were more white Peterbilts. The convoy had grown to dozens of trucks, all following the same formation, all moving at the same speed. Ray tried his cell phone, but the screen showed no service despite having full signal bars. His GPS was completely blank, showing no roads, no landmarks, no indication of where they were. According to his navigation system, they were driving through empty space. The road stretched on for hours without curves, hills, or intersections, just straight pavement through absolute darkness. Ray's headlights illuminated only the truck in front of him and a few feet of road. Beyond that, nothing existed. No trees, no grass, no horizon, just black void on all sides. Ray's fuel gauge had been on empty for over 100 miles, but his engine never missed a beat. His truck seemed to be running on something other than diesel. The temperature gauge showed normal readings. The oil pressure was steady, but Ray could feel that his truck was no longer operating by normal mechanical principles. Around what should have been dawn, Ray noticed that time had stopped making sense. His dashboard clock was frozen at 2 a.m., but he'd been driving for what felt like 24 hours. The darkness outside never changed, never showed any sign of approaching sunrise. The convoy existed in a permanent state of 2 a.m. On a February night. Ray tried to communicate with other drivers in the convoy, but his CB only carried that same mechanical voice. "Maintain formation. Maintain speed. The delivery schedule must be kept." When Ray asked what they were delivering, the response was always the same. "The route is the delivery. The convoy is the cargo. Keep driving." Ray's logbook began filling itself in with entries he didn't make. Page after page of mileage records, fuel purchases, and delivery confirmations for loads he'd never carried to destinations that didn't exist. The handwriting wasn't his, but it was consistent across all entries, as if the same person had been filling out his logbook for years. Days passed, or what felt like days. Ray stopped feeling hungry, stopped needing rest breaks, stopped caring about anything except maintaining his position in the convoy. His truck became an extension of his body, responding to the formation's needs rather than his own decisions. Ray began to understand that the other drivers in the convoy had once been like him, independent truckers who'd encountered the formation and been absorbed into it. The mechanical voice on the CB wasn't coming from a dispatcher or other drivers. It was coming from the convoy itself, from all the absorbed drivers speaking in unison. Sometimes, in brief moments of clarity, Ray would try to break free. He'd fight against his truck's automatic steering, try to force his way out of formation, but the effort would exhaust him, and he'd fall back into the hypnotic rhythm of the convoy. Each attempt to escape became weaker, less determined. Ray's last clear memory was seeing a lone trucker approaching the convoy on what might have been I-75. Ray tried to warn him over the CB, tried to tell him to stay away, but the words that came out of his mouth weren't his own. "Welcome to the permanent route, driver. Your delivery schedule has been extended. Ray's truck is still out there somewhere. Truck number 7 in a convoy that grows longer every night." Drivers on I-75 sometimes report seeing white Peterbilts traveling in perfect formation, moving at exactly 55 mph with their hazards flashing. Some truckers try to join the convoy, thinking it's a legitimate group heading to the same destination. The convoy appears most often on foggy nights when visibility is poor, recruiting new drivers who think they're joining a safety group. Once you fall into formation behind those white trucks, your delivery schedule becomes permanent. The only cargo you'll ever haul again is yourself. And the only destination is the endless road that exists between 2 a.m. and nowhere. Veteran truckers know to avoid convoys of identical white trucks, especially ones that move with unnatural precision. They know that some formations aren't heading anywhere you want to go, and some deliveries never end. The highway system is hidden routes that don't appear on any map, traveled by drivers who forgot how to stop driving and became part of the road itself. Carl Morrison had crossed the scales at thousands of weigh stations during his years of long-haul trucking. But the inspection station on Highway 90 in Montana became the place where his understanding of weight and measurement would be forever changed. What happened there on a stormy night in March made Carl question not just his cargo, but his own grip on reality. Carl was hauling furniture from North Carolina to Seattle when a late-season blizzard forced him to take shelter. The Montana Department of Transportation had closed several mountain passes, leaving Carl stranded on Highway 90 with limited options for safe parking. Through the swirling snow, he spotted the lights of a weigh station and decided to ride out the storm there. The station looked standard from the outside. A small building, scales embedded in the pavement, and the usual signs about mandatory inspection. But something felt off immediately. The building's windows were lit, but Carl couldn't see anyone inside. No movement, no shadows, just a steady fluorescent glow that seemed too bright for the storm conditions. Carl parked his rig and walked to the building to check if he could wait there. The door was unlocked, but when he stepped inside, the place was completely empty. No inspection officers, no paperwork on the desks, no personal items anywhere. The fluorescent lights hummed with an intensity that made Carl's teeth ache, and the air had a metallic taste that reminded him of licking a battery. What bothered Carl most was the silence. Weigh stations are never completely quiet. There's always the hum of computers, the sound of radio chatter, or the basic ambient noise of any working facility. This place was tomb silent, except for those fluorescent lights, which seemed to pulse in a rhythm that didn't match any electrical frequency Carl knew. Carl decided to stay in his truck instead. But when he tried to leave, his engine wouldn't start. The electrical system was completely dead. No dashboard lights, no radio, nothing. Carl had been a mechanic before becoming a trucker, and he knew his electrical systems. This wasn't a normal failure. It was like something had drained every bit of power from his truck instantly. Stranded, Carl returned to the building to wait for the storm to pass. Inside, he noticed details he'd missed the first time. The inspection equipment was there, but it was old, much older than standard DOT gear. The scale's readouts showed analog dials instead of digital displays, and the certification stickers were dated from the 1950s, faded and peeling. Carl tried the phone on the desk to call for help. But when he picked up the receiver, instead of a dial tone, he heard what sounded like conversations. Multiple voices talking at once, but not to each other, like recordings of different phone calls playing simultaneously. He could make out fragments. Total weight exceeds legal limits. Cargo manifest doesn't match. Driver has been detained for further inspection. Carl hung up quickly, but the voices continued anyway, now coming from the walls themselves. The building seemed to be replaying decades of conversations between inspection officers and drivers, all happening at once in a disturbing audio collage. Around midnight, Carl heard the rumble of a truck engine outside. Through the window, he watched a big rig pull onto the scales. The truck looked vintage, like something from the 1970s, and the driver who climbed out wore clothes that matched. Flannel shirt, trucker cap, the kind of style Carl remembered from his early days in trucking. Carl went outside to greet the other driver, grateful for human company. But when he called out, the man didn't respond. He walked to the building like Carl wasn't there, entered through the same door Carl had used, but when Carl followed him inside, the building was empty again. Carl walked back outside to look at the truck on the scales. The digital readout, which hadn't been working when Carl first arrived, now showed the truck's weight, 47,000 lbs, far over the legal limits for any highway truck. But the trailer looked normal-sized, certainly not big enough to carry that much weight. As Carl watched, the truck pulled off the scales and drove away into the storm. But the weight display didn't reset. It continued showing 47,000 lbs, even with nothing on the scales. Over the next hour, more trucks arrived. Each one looked older than it should be. Each driver seemed oblivious to Carl's presence, and each vehicle registered impossible weights on the scales. A pickup truck showed 24,000 lbs. A small delivery van registered 30,000 lbs. A motorcycle somehow weighed 15,000 lbs. Carl realized he was watching something that shouldn't be possible. These vehicles were being weighed for more than their physical mass. The scales were measuring something else, something that couldn't be seen but added tremendous weight to every vehicle to cross them. Carl tried to leave again, but his truck still wouldn't start. He was trapped at a weigh station that was operating on rules that didn't follow the laws of physics. As dawn approached, more vehicles appeared, forming a line that stretched back into the storm. All vintage trucks, all carrying impossible weights, all driven by people who couldn't see Carl. Around 6 a.m., an inspection officer finally appeared in the building. Carl rushed inside to ask for help, but the officer looked through him like he wasn't there. The man, wearing a uniform that looked decades out of date, began processing paperwork that materialized on his desk as he worked. Carl watched the officer stamp documents for trucks that had weighed impossible amounts. Each paper showed cargo manifests for things that made no sense. 50,000 lbs of regret and missed opportunities, unfinished conversations, promises that were never kept. Carl understood then that the weigh station wasn't measuring physical cargo. It was weighing the emotional and psychological burdens that drivers carried. Every trucker who had ever crossed these scales had left behind some part of their personal weight, their guilt, their regrets, their unresolved pain. The station had been collecting this intangible cargo for decades, and the accumulation was so heavy that it bent reality around itself. Time moved differently here, allowing trucks from different eras to use the same scales simultaneously. The weight of human suffering had become literal weight that could be measured and recorded. Carl looked at his own reflection in the building's window and realized he was becoming translucent. The longer he stayed at the station, the more of his own weight was being transferred to the scales. His physical presence was diminishing as his emotional burdens were measured and cataloged. Carl ran back to his truck and tried the engine again. This time it started, but when he looked at his dashboard, his fuel gauge showed empty. His odometer had reset to 0, and his logbook was filled with entries he'd never made. Pages and pages of driving records going back decades, as if he'd been making runs for years. He'd never lived. Carl drove away from the weigh station as fast as the storm conditions allowed, but when he checked his mirrors, the station was still visible no matter how far he traveled. It remained in his side mirrors like a fixed point that followed him down the highway. When Carl finally reached Seattle and delivered his load, the receiving dock supervisor looked confused. "This delivery was scheduled for 1995, the man said, checking his paperwork. "We've been waiting 30 years for this furniture." Carl checked his own paperwork. The bill of lading was dated March 7, 1995. The furniture he'd been hauling was indeed 3 decades overdue. Somehow at the weigh station, Carl had been assigned a delivery that had been lost in time, carrying cargo that should have been delivered before he'd even started trucking. Carl never drove Highway 90 again, but he heard stories from other truckers about the weigh station that operated outside normal hours. Drivers reported being detained there during storms, only to emerge with cargo that didn't match their original load and delivery schedules that were decades off. The Montana DOT has no record of a way station at that location on Highway 90, but trucker GPS units sometimes direct them there during severe weather. The scales still operate, still weigh vehicles for more than their physical mass. Some loads require more than diesel fuel and determination to deliver. They require drivers willing to carry burdens that can't be seen but can definitely be felt. Carl's truck was never quite the same after that night. His fuel consumption increased permanently, as if his rig was hauling invisible cargo. His logbook continued filling itself with phantom entries for deliveries he'd never made. Most disturbing of all, his truck's gross weight always registered several thousand lbs higher than it should, no matter how light his actual cargo. The weigh station measures more than freight. It weighs the accumulated emotional burden of every driver who's ever felt the isolation of the highway, the guilt of time away from family, the regret of roads not taken. Some weight can't be shed by simply unloading a trailer. It becomes part of the truck, part of the driver, part of the endless cycle of delivery and departure that defines life on the road. Jake had been driving for hours, hauling electronics from California to New York with a tight deadline. It was 2 a.m. on a humid August night in Nebraska, and he was exhausted, barely able to keep his eyes open. The road stretched endlessly before him, but then, in the distance, the rest stop appeared, seemingly a blessing in his headlights. It looked like any other, a parking lot with a brick building, restrooms, vending machines, and picnic tables scattered around. But something felt off. There were more vehicles than usual for 2 a.m. Dozens of cars and big rigs were parked, and people were wandering around, sitting at picnic tables, and coming and going from the building. It was the kind of activity you'd expect during the daytime, not the dead of night. Jake felt a small sense of relief. At least he wasn't alone. He parked his truck and walked toward the building. As he got closer to the other visitors, something felt wrong. Their movements were slow, too deliberate, like they were walking underwater. None of them seemed to acknowledge each other. They moved in a strange, shuffling pattern. Inside the building, the fluorescent lights flickered harshly, casting strange, moving shadows. The vending machines hummed loudly, but when Jake looked closely, the products inside were unrecognizable. Brands he didn't recognize, and packaging that looked decades out of date. He tried to buy a coffee, but when he inserted a dollar bill, the machine made a grinding noise and returned coins that weren't U.S. currency quarters and dimes with strange faces and symbols, dates that read years far in the future. The restroom was even more bizarre. The fixtures looked clean but outdated, like something from the 70s. The mirrors reflected Jake's image, but with a slight delay, like his reflection was trying to catch up with him. When Jake washed his hands, the water had a strange metallic taste, like something was off in the pipes. Back outside, Jake tried to strike up conversations with the other people, but they didn't respond. Their eyes were unfocused, as if they were seeing something behind him instead of looking at his face. Their answers were always the same. Nice night for driving, been on the road a while, long way to go. But no one was actually leaving. The vehicles sat in place, their drivers getting in and out, but never moving. It was like a carousel of people and vehicles in a never-ending loop. Jake's CB radio crackled with voices, but the conversations made no sense. Drivers reported locations that didn't exist, mile marker infinity. Between yesterday and tomorrow, hauling a load of empty time to Deadline Junction. When Jake tried to ask for directions or road conditions, the responses were cryptic. Time moves differently here. The road goes where it needs to go. Your delivery schedule has been adjusted. Jake decided to rest for a few hours, but when he climbed into his cab, sleep wouldn't come. He could hear the same repetitive sounds from the rest stop outside. Car doors slamming, footsteps on pavement, the same voices repeating over and over. He checked his dashboard clock. It still read 2 a.m., the same time he had arrived. His logbook showed no time had passed either. Confused, Jake tried to start his truck again, but the engine sputtered and turned over weakly. The headlights barely illuminated the ground. The CB radio was full of static, and his cell phone had no signal, even though he'd had full bars when he first arrived. He got out of the truck and walked back toward the building, hoping someone could help. But the people were now standing still, staring in the direction of his truck, their eyes vacant. He approached one woman, dressed in an outdated fashion. "Excuse me, can you help me? My truck won't start." She turned to face him, but her movement was mechanical, like a mannequin being rotated. "You should rest," she said in a flat voice. "You've been driving too long. Rest here with us." Jake backed away, feeling a chill run down his spine. Every person he approached said the same thing, in the same emotionless tone. "Rest here with us." "You've been driving too long." Desperate, Jake ran back to his truck, started the engine again, and tried to drive out of the rest stop. But as he drove, his headlights revealed something horrifying. The road simply ended. There was nothing beyond the parking lot, no darkness, no empty space, just an invisible barrier. Jake tried turning in another direction, but every route led to the same nothingness. He was trapped in a pocket of reality, disconnected from the interstate system. Back inside the building, Jake found something else. A payphone that hadn't been there before. When he picked up the receiver, he heard his own voice. "Hello, Jake. You've been driving too long. You need to rest." He slammed the phone down, but it immediately rang again. This time, it was his wife's voice. "Jake, where are you? You were supposed to deliver that load days ago. The company is looking for you." The call cut off, and when Jake tried to dial out, the phone gave the message. "The number you have dialed is not in service in this area." Jake's logbook was filling itself in with entries he hadn't made. Rest breaks at the same location, all with the same timestamp, 2 a.m. His logbook now showed that he had been taking the same rest break for weeks, but the reality was that only a few hours had passed. The time was stuck, and Jake felt more and more trapped. He tried to wake the other drivers, but they were too far gone. They wandered around in an endless loop, trapped in this temporal prison, moving through the same routines over and over again. Some of their trucks were deteriorating, like his own. The paint was fading, tires were wearing down, and the engines were struggling. In the building's restroom, Jake found personal items scattered on the floor: wallets, driver's licenses, family photos. The IDs belonged to missing truckers. Their faces now the blank, empty shells of the people still wandering outside. He picked up one license, belonging to Robert Martinez, a driver who had vanished in 1998. The photo showed a man with a warm smile, but when Jake found Robert wandering outside, he was a hollow version of his former self. "This is you," Jake said, showing him the license. Robert stared at it blankly, and, for a split second, something flickered in his eyes: recognition. But then it was gone. "Nice night for driving," Robert said, and shuffled away. Jake began finding more IDs, each one belonging to a driver or traveler who had gone missing over the years. Their faces matched the blank-eyed wanderers he saw outside, stuck in the same loop of wandering, with no memory of where they were going or why. The rest stop existed across different decades, a trap for travelers who had arrived exhausted, seeking rest, but instead became permanent residents of this twisted reality. The worst discovery came when Jake found his own entry in the guest register, signed in his own handwriting, dated weeks before. Below his signature were hundreds of other entries, all written on the same day. It was as if he had checked in repeatedly for weeks, but he had only been there for hours. Jake realized the truth. The rest stop was feeding off the exhaustion of travelers, trapping their consciousness in a never-ending loop of arrival, wandering, and waiting. There was no escape. Some people had lost all awareness of who they were, but others, like Eleanor, an elderly woman, still remembered pieces of their past. Eleanor explained that the rest stop consumed everything a person brought with them: their vehicle, their cargo, their identity. Some people managed to break free, but they had to leave everything behind, including their sanity. Jake decided to escape. He gathered a few personal items and made his way to an abandoned sedan. The keys were still in the ignition, left by someone who had tried to escape before. But as he prepared to leave, his CB radio crackled with his wife's voice, repeating the same worried calls for help. Jake knew the rest stop was playing back recordings to keep him trapped. In a final, desperate attempt, Jake hot-wired the abandoned car and drove toward the barrier of nothingness. The trapped people surrounded his car, pressing their hands against the windows, their blank faces suddenly showing emotion. Jake read Eleanor's lips. "Tell my daughter I love her." He gunned the engine and drove straight into the void. For a few terrifying seconds, he was driving through absolute nothingness, with no sense of movement or direction. Then, just as suddenly, he was back on the highway. The rest stop was gone, as if it had never existed. Jake's truck was gone, along with his cargo and his livelihood, but his notes survived. Jake found a real truck stop and called his company, reporting his truck stolen. He never went back to retrieve it. The next week, his notes made their way to the families of missing truckers. The FBI investigated, but found no trace of the rest stop at the coordinates Jake had provided. However, the missing persons were real, and the families finally got some closure. Jake started a blog about highway safety, warning drivers about the dangers of driving while fatigued, though he never mentioned the supernatural aspects of his experience. Late at night, his old CB radio would crackle with familiar voices, still trapped in the rest stop's endless loop, asking for help that would never come. And somewhere, out there, the rest stop still waits, its guest register filling with new names, its parking lot filled with the same wandering souls, trapped in an eternal cycle of almost rest.